Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to everyone, wherever you are in space or time. As you can see, I've got a mask. I'm in Florida. My name is Jack Ballantyne, and I'm going to be your moderator for what should be an interesting and thought-provoking panel discussion that is in accord with the theme of the meeting, which is partnership in criminal justice. This particular panel is principally targeted towards an American time zone. Thus, participants will mainly be from North, South, and Central America. However, I'm sure we will be joined by other participants across the world, depending upon their interests and sleeping habits. We've already heard how DNA has had an impact on the criminal justice system. This panel discussion follows on from this, and will focus on how we can maximize that impact. So, the typical course of an investigation proceeds as follows. A crime occurs, which involves a victim. Law enforcement investigates the case circumstances. A suspect is developed, and if sufficient evidence exists, brought to trial by a career prosecutor. The role of the forensic scientist is via circumstantial physical evidence to help establish facts that may be in question. Forensic science providers thus can help with both the investigative phase and the dispositive, that is the court phase. So law enforcement, prosecutors, and forensic scientists need to work together as a team if justice is to be best served. We cannot forget the victim in all of this. The whole point of prosecuting and convicting a perpetrator is to provide justice for the victim and some sense of closure to the victims and or their loved ones. Thus, victims often also play a role during the investigation and prosecution of crime. Indeed, in the DNA era, victims' advocates have played an important role in persuading the body politic of the need for legislation to promote the effective use of DNA analysis. So given the necessity for teamwork, we've assembled a distinguished panel of experts that includes a law enforcement investigator, a legal expert, a victim's advocate, and a forensic expert to discuss how to get the most out of forensic DNA. So the format of the session will be as follows. I will ask each of the panelists in turn to briefly introduce themselves, why they're here, and give their initial thoughts from a 30,000 feet perspective on what they think is an important thing they would like to see done that would help maximize the impact of forensic DNA in the criminal justice system. Once these initial introductions and personal perspectives have been completed, we will proceed to discuss in more detail a number of pre-chosen topics. During the panel session, we will take and encourage general or specifically addressed questions from the audience through the Q&A function. So if any members of the audience would like to ask questions, please feel free to do so through the Q&A function. So without further ado, let me introduce the panel. Firstly, the law enforcement investigator. We have Fred Harran, Director of Public Safety from Bensalem Township, Pennsylvania. Fred?
Thank you, Jack. Good afternoon, good morning, as Jack had said, where everybody is in the world. My name is Fred Harran. I'm the Director of Public Safety for Bensalem, the Township Police Department. Director of Public Safety, for those of you that don't know, it's an equivalent to the police chief. So I just want you to understand what that means. Let me tell you a little bit real quick about where we are, because I'm sure no one here has heard of Bensalem Township. So Bensalem Township, we border Philadelphia in the U.S., right on their northern border. We border it on multiple fronts. The city of Philadelphia, which is the fifth largest city in the United States. Unfortunately, the good things and bad things about bordering a big city is it comes with big city crime and big city problems as well. And Philadelphia region, the four counties and Philadelphia are the opioid capital of the United States, where there's so much opioid distribution that it affects many, many other crimes. And what we started to find is that when we were utilizing the database like CODIS, the federal national database, it was really going after homicides and sexual assaults. There's 18,000 police departments in the United States. Most of them are like me, small departments. I have 106 sworn in my municipality, and my biggest problems, thank God, are not homicide and sexual assault, but they are property crime. They are some robberies, but also mainly burglaries and thefts. And the CODIS database was not something that was really attacking that. So in 2010, we looked at a local database and collecting our own DNA from suspects and from crime scenes, from every crime scene. And then in 2017, we became the first police department in the United States to have a rapid DNA instrument in the police department operating 24/7 by law enforcement officers. And we've taken DNA to a whole new height here. We utilize DNA every day, and that's our motto. It's just not a program. It's a philosophy. It's a way of life. And some of the results that we've seen is we've seen a 42% reduction in burglaries. We've seen a 51% reduction in robbery. We've seen I think it's about a 26% reduction in auto theft. So we're seeing some incredible reductions, and we're utilizing DNA every day for every crime possible, and especially drugs, small amounts of drugs or drug delivery. We're making sure we take DNA, not just from the crime scenes and the evidence, but also from the people that we come in contact with. And we'll talk about that more later when we get into some questions. So thank you, and thank you for having me, Jack.
Thanks, Fred. The next panelist is the legal expert, Anne-Marie Schubert, who's the elected Sacramento County District Attorney. Anne-Marie?
Good morning, Dr. Ballantyne. Thank you all for having me out here in California. It's 9 o'clock in the morning. Just a little background about myself. I've been the elected district attorney in Sacramento since 2015, but I've been really a career prosecutor since 1990. My first introduction to DNA was in the early 90s. My first prosecution involving a serial rapist, and it was the first hearing that I had to do with the admissibility of DNA. And it was at that time in the mid-90s that I realized that DNA is the greatest tool ever given to law enforcement to find the truth, no matter what that truth is. And so I've had the fortune of working in this field as a prosecutor for 20-something years. And I've tried a lot of cases involving DNA, realized the value of CODIS and the DNA data bank. And through that time, I've also come to realize that we have to use DNA to the best of our ability, not only to identify the guilty, but to exonerate the innocent. And so many folks probably know that somewhat of the culmination of our use of DNA has recently come in the last couple of years with now the introduction of what I call investigative genetic genealogy. And many people probably know that our office, the Sacramento DA's office, and many other DA's offices have come together and are currently prosecuting the alleged Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, for a series of murders and rapes that occurred here in California. So I am 100% behind this technology, and I'm just honored to be here, Dr. Ballantyne. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. We have a victims advocate, Jayann Sepich, who's a victims advocate and a founder of DNA Saves. Jayann?
Thank you, Dr. Valentine. Hello, everyone. In 2003, my daughter Katie was a 22-year-old graduate student at New Mexico State University when she was very brutally raped and murdered. And there was very little evidence in her case, but Katie fought hard for her life. And underneath her fingernail was the skin and blood of the man that had killed her. And the detective in charge of her case told me about the CODIS system, and he explained to me that a DNA profile had been extracted from that blood and skin found under her fingernails and uploaded into the National Forensic DNA database called CODIS. And he explained to me that they did not find a match when they put that in there, but once a week they would be running it again and look for a match between her crime scene evidence, which was found under her fingernails, and the offender that might have done this, that would have done this to her if there's a match. And this gave us bright hope because we knew we had the identity of Katie's killer. We just had to match a name to it. And I made the offhand comment that this man was such a monster that he would be arrested again and they would swab his cheek and we would identify him. And that's when I learned that at that time in New Mexico, my home state, and almost every other state, it was illegal to take someone's DNA when they were arrested for a crime. So in 2005, our family decided to make it our mission to change laws all across the country so that we could expand the DNA database to include a profile from those arrested for a crime. And now 31 states do have a law that requires that DNA be taken as a result of a felony arrest. And we will continue to try to get every state to have this law across the country. It brings justice to families like ours, to victims. It also prevents future crimes, which means it prevents that horrible agony that families go through as a result of a crime. So from my perspective, the best way that we can maximize DNA is to expand the database, to include more offenders, more crime scene evidence. And I also believe that rapid DNA, which is now just becoming a reality, will be a wonderful, wonderful tool to maximize the use of DNA. So thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Jayann. Our forensic expert is Anna Dadhania, a forensic scientist in the Science and Technology Unit of the Orange County District Attorney's Office in California. So, Anna?
Thank you, Jack. As you said, I work at the Orange County District Attorney's Office, which is a little bit different than most forensic scientists who work in the crime lab. I work actually alongside prosecutors and investigators. And our mission here in the Science and Technology Unit is to truly harness the power of forensic DNA to not only use it as a crime solving tool, but also use it as a crime stopping tool. So with that, back in 2007, our office started a local DNA database program. It's a consensual database, and that was started based off of the need to combat property crime. And then in 2014, we brought on the Rapid DNA program, which we have seen tremendous success in helping not only solve crime, but stop it in its tracks. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So let's move on then to, now that we have the panel impaneled, let's discuss some pre-chosen topics. Let's start with DNA databases, although we've covered some of this already, but basically DNA databases come in multiple flavors. First of all, we have the well-established, legally supported government convicted offender arrestee databases, which will also include crime scene samples. This is exemplified, of course, in the US by CODIS, but most other developed nations have some such database. And the samples that are input have to meet rigorous quality assurance standards. This type of database is used in both the dispositive phase, that is the court phase, and the intelligence phase of the criminal investigation. However, more recently, as we've heard, other databases, the sole purpose of which is for intelligence purposes, and are characteristically lacking explicit specific legal authorization, but are nevertheless still legal since they comprise samples that are voluntarily provided. Examples include the local person of interest database and crime scene material that Fred Harran just talked about, which are often associated with the use of a rapid DNA program, and genealogical databases that Anne-Marie talked about briefly also. So the first question to the panelists would be, how do you currently use DNA databases, but how do you measure their impact? So not just how do you use them, you may have discussed that already, but also how do you measure the impact of these databases? So I'm going to ask Anna to start with that question.
Thank you, Jack. So here in California, local law enforcement DNA databases are allowed by California law for identification purposes. So back in 2007, our office decided to start a DNA database collection program, and it was decided that it would be based on the voluntary consent to provide DNA as part of plea deals on misdemeanors. So these cases would not typically be eligible for CODIS. So this is offered by the district attorney's office and the courts. And consent for giving DNA is given in front of the judge, the defense attorney, and the prosecutor. So to date, we have over 195,000 individuals in our database, which is larger than many even state databases in the United States. And this is separate and apart from the CODIS database, which is also in California. In addition, our local CODIS database, the Orange County Crime Lab, also sends all their DNA profiles from crime scene evidence to be searched against our database. So this includes profiles that are submitted to CODIS and also profiles that are not eligible for CODIS. So we have over 13,000 crime scene profiles in our database as well. So this gives Orange County, which has over 3 million people and over 30 law enforcement agencies, a huge additional tool to solve crime. Many of these individuals will not be in the CODIS databases because these misdemeanors do not qualify for state collection. And in addition, since we have this local DNA database, we're able to have a successful rapid DNA program where we can run crime scene evidence and get DNA profiles and search them against our local DNA database. Because as of now, rapid DNA profiles are not allowed to be searched against CODIS. So the way to really harness that new technology is with our local DNA database program. So it started with just seeing that databases are necessary to combat not only and solve higher level crimes like murders and rapes, but also with property crimes. So we've seen a huge success in solving these property crimes where these individuals would not be in the database, in the state database otherwise.
Thank you. What about the impact? Do you measure the impact quantitatively in any way, shape, or form to help improve your program?
Well, so we get, depending on the week, we get, close to 30, 40, 50 hits, depending on how many profiles that we have to search. But the hard part is, and we've tried to quantitate it, is like at what are you quantifying at what point in the whole investigation or in I guess in the filing stage or in the court process, of what part are you quantitating? So it's kind of a difficult thing to quantitate, but we have seen that our agencies see much more, many more hits because of this, that these misdemeanors, these offenders that are committing the misdemeanors would not have been in the state database otherwise. And we see these hits and we see that also that these offenders, they're reoffending in the same town, the same county. So being collected here and having these local offenders in our database is a huge help.
Okay, thank you. I should like to remind the audience that please ask questions as we're going along here through that Q&A function or Q&A section. Fred, is there anything else you'd like to add to that? Because I know that your agency, you have spent a lot of time with the impact side of things with regard to rapid DNA, the success of it within your jurisdiction.
Yeah, no, and Anna said it so well in her opening and in this last question. But the impact and the real success is stopping crime in its tracks. So in Pennsylvania, it was taking 12 to 18 months to get DNA processed in our state lab. There's only one lab that deals with all 1,200 police departments, with the exception of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh police that have their own labs. So everybody was sending all their DNA to one lab. So that really wasn't working. Getting DNA results back in 12 to 18 months is not getting results back. So when we started with local databasing, we started getting results back in 30 days. And now when we're on board with Rapid, we're getting DNA back in 90 minutes. So when we have someone in custody for a crime and we throw them through the Rapid machine, they hit to our local database and they hit to 2 or 3 burglaries or some thefts or whatever other jobs that we have open out there, that's getting them off the street. And it's not so much, like Anna said, not so much about arresting the criminal, but that person is not on the street at 91 minutes to commit their next crime. And if you are a victim or a possibly potential victim, which you'll never know that you were a potential victim because Rapid DNA took that person off the street and that criminal never got an opportunity to victimize your family. And our results, as I said, 42% reduction in burglary is some amazing, amazing results. And I think it's a 53% reduction in robbery. I think I said 51 before. I just checked my stats real quick. So, and a 46% reduction in auto theft. So it's some incredible numbers. And that's really, how this works. For us, as Jayann said, we're one of the 19 that are not arrestee states. So I'm a convicted felon state in Pennsylvania, which really does me no good. Like Anna said, most of the criminals are local. A lot of them aren't going to jail for felonies. In these days, it's even harder to incarcerate people. So, getting them off the street and getting charges on them for multiple cases is more likely to get them off the street so they cannot victimize anybody else. And at the end of the day, no matter what you're doing in the criminal justice, whether you're an analyst, you're a DA or a victim's advocate or law enforcement, whatever you are, your end of the day goal is to make sure there's one less victim. And that's what local databasing and Rapid does.
Okay, thanks, Fred. Coming to Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie is a prosecutor, so she uses databases in court. For sure, she'll use the CODIS database. I'm not so sure about the voluntary databases, but do you have any comment, Anne, regarding Anne-Marie? Sorry, how you currently use these databases and measure the impact? Any comment about the use of these two types of databases as a prosecutor?
I mean, I think since the really the mid 90s, the expansion of these databases has astronomically increased our ability to solve crime. So when Jayann talks about the importance of the felony arrestee provisions, that is critical. I mean, we've seen in California, we do have that provision, and it was similar to Jayann. It was led by Bruce Harrington, who's the brother of a victim of the Golden State Killer. But prior to that law being passed, our ability to solve crime in CODIS was limited. But since that time, there's been well over 70,000 cases. So you take that database, and then in California, we now allow familial searching, which has been allowed for about nine or 10 years. And then just recently in the last 2 years, the use of genealogy databases. So that is going to astronomically, again, increase our ability to solve crime. So our analysis as a prosecutor is always the balance of public safety versus privacy interests. And there are privacy interests involved. But for us in our casework, we're not actually using the database in court. What we're simply doing is those databases, whether it's CODIS, whether it's a genealogy site, are an investigative lead. And then we're always going to rely on our crime labs to go back to traditional DNA testing, such as obviously STR. So like a genealogy site might lead us to a potential relative, and that then leads us to the suspect. But we're always going to go back to traditional DNA. We're going to use STRs. We're going to get a one-to-one comparison, and we're ultimately going to use that one-to-one comparison. So while CODIS and genealogy sites are leading us to our suspect, it's ultimately that one-to-one comparison that is going to be utilized in a courtroom.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Anne-Marie. So let's consider then, how do you overcome any public and political challenges related to the expansion of forensic DNA databases? Because the theme seems to be we'd like to expand these databases that would be more useful. So firstly, what role can victim advocates play in helping expand and implementing DNA database legislation? And of course, Jayann has had quite a bit of experience with doing that. So what role can the victim advocates play, Jayann, in helping expand and implementing the legislation for DNA databases? Jayann?
Thank you, Jack. I think the most important role that we play is opening up the conversation and putting a victim's face on these conversations and opening up people's hearts and minds. But it's not enough just to talk about, why it hurts us, why we need to prevent these crimes. We also need to educate, and we need to explain to these policymakers how these systems really work and how they are not an invasion of privacy and how they actually save the taxpayers money. And when I testify, I have a lot of facts and figures that back this up, studies that have been done, and also successes. We can say in my home state of New Mexico, we've had over 2,000 matches between crime scene evidence and those that were arrested for a felony, and how successful we have been and how those leads have brought convictions. And that's really the role that victims advocates play, is putting a face on that law, saying why this is important, and also then education and showing exactly how those systems work.
Thank you, Jayann. Basically, and Anne-Marie did mention this briefly, but privacy issues, is privacy issues an impediment, you think? Or are privacy issues an impediment to persuading the body politic to help expand these databases? Anne-Marie, do you believe that privacy issues are a potential impediment to the use of these databases?
I think privacy issues are real, but they're also something that, like Jayann mentioned, if we can educate the public. So, for instance, one of the misinformations out there with genealogy sites is somehow law enforcement has their hands on people's DNA that are in genealogy sites. That's simply not accurate. But how do we address privacy is that what we've done in California and what we've advocated really across the world is follow a best practice, develop what we call an MOU, a policy guideline. So for instance, when we're using genealogy sites, we're not going to use a genealogy site to solve a nonviolent crime. We're going to use a genealogy site, like for instance in California, where we're only looking at violent crimes. So it's a rape or it's a rape murder. So if you start to look at what's happened since 2018, since the arrest of the alleged Golden State Killer, well over 100 cases have now been solved using genealogy sites, but they're all rape murders. And so we're trying to follow the guidelines that were put forth in California when we started familial searching in 2009, which is to balance that privacy against public safety, utilize it when we've really exhausted all other potential sources of investigation, and really follow this best practice. So violent crimes, exhausted all leads. And again, we're not sharing anybody's DNA. People that upload their DNA to a genealogy site, there's 26 million people that have done that. Law enforcement has their hands only on the bad guy's DNA because he left it behind. So education and following best practices are really the keys to overcoming any impediments when we start talking about privacy. Okay, thank you, Anne-Marie. So now let's take some audience questions, shall we? We have a couple of questions here. Let me see. This is a question for Anna. Are local databases like Orange County's limited on the method of DNA analysis, PCR versus next generation sequencing, or are they able to utilize other technologies? Anna.
So here in Orange County, we use just PCR. So our database is composed of STR profiles. California law, however, doesn't specify what kind of technology is used. It just says that law enforcement databases are allowed for identification purposes.
Okay. Question for Fred. Fred, how did your agency get the samples to develop a local database?
Yeah. So there's nothing in Pennsylvania law talking about databases. So we just started our local database, and we collect DNA on every crime scene. So that's how we get forensic samples. As far as reference samples, we ask everybody. As I said, we're a convicted felon state, so there's nothing that precludes me from asking and getting consensual DNA. We have about 95% of the people that we ask give us their DNA. It's crazy, and people don't understand why someone would give up their DNA, but they do. I have my theories on it, but they give us their DNA. We read them a applied consent that was written by our district attorney's office. It covers everything, and he changes it every now and then, adds more things in there, which I'm all in favor of. We let the person swab their own mouth. We let them know that this is for criminal investigations. So there's no questioning what we're doing with the DNA. And again, 95% of the people give it to us. We have about 34,000 profiles in our database. And for us, that's pretty darn good since we started 2010 with 0. So, and we've got some great success. So people give up their DNA.
Yeah. So a general question is, what is one of the most unusual samples you've been successful with getting DNA from? Would anyone like to take that question? Just what kind of unusual samples have you had where DNA could be obtained from?
I'll throw something out there, Jack. This is way back in the mid-90s, was DNA off of a leaf. I had a victim that was kidnapped and raped in a driveway of somebody's car, and there was a leaf on the ground, and the perpetrator left his semen on the leaf. So incredible work by the crime lab.
Wow. Okay.
You win.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I think we can move on to the next series of pre-chosen questions. We will continue to take questions from the audience. Let's move on then to new technologies, integration of new technologies into operations, the challenges and strategies to overcome new technologies. So some of the panelists currently use rapid DNA technology. So in what ways is it being used in your jurisdiction? Well, we've heard that already, but basically, how can other jurisdictions basically implement this technology in their own area? Fred?
So, as I said in the opening, we have the instrument, the rapid ID machine is in the police station, and it could be operated at 3 o'clock in the morning. I have all my supervisors and all my detectives are trained in its use and are able to utilize it. So the whole purpose of this great technology is to get 90-minute DNA results and get someone off the street and hopefully get them arraigned at 3 o'clock in the morning, thereby stopping their crime spree. The other thing that we use it for also is exoneration, and we haven't talked about that yet. A lot of folks will come on, and a lot of people will be against what we're doing, but this has already been used by us to exonerate people. We had a sexual assault case that was ironclad case without DNA. Victim positively identified the guy. The guy had no alibi. The guy was a career sex offender. All these things. But to make a long story short, we got his DNA, and he was already incarcerated and for this crime, and we cleared him. So we got him out of jail immediately. So RAPID could be used for that, and also used for identification of bodies. And we've done that. We did it on a case where 4 boys 2 summers ago were killed in our county, and 3 were buried in one spot and 1 was buried in another spot. And the 3 bodies were beyond recognition, and we were able to get DNA off their toothbrushes and then DNA off of them, and we were able to identify them to give families closure. So not only for criminal investigations, but for exoneration and for identification. And the uses of this technology is endless.
Yes. Anna, do you want to add anything? That obviously Fred's from the law enforcement side. You're from the lab side. About implementing and the challenges you face, or what the other agencies would face in terms of implementing a rapid DNA program from the lab standpoint?
Yeah, so here we use the Rapid Hit 200 instrument. And what we see with rapid DNA technology is that it's great. It's very fast. We get our results, our instruments 2 hours, but it's limited to high quantity DNA samples. So we limit our submissions to blood, cigarette butts, buccal swabs, gum, semen if it's not from a sexual assault kit, and saliva. And in addition to that, we make sure that there's always enough sample that 2 samples can be processed. So the priority is always for the crime lab. So our crime lab gets a primary piece of evidence. So if it's a blood stain, they'll get the first swab, and then the second swab will be submitted to Rapid DNA for our investigative lead or for the pointer. And the reason being is that crime scene evidence that's processed at the crime lab will be the one that's used for court purposes. And we do this on a wide range of crime types, from serious and violent crimes to property crimes. So like Fred's program, we operate 24/7. Depending on the crime, we will roll out in the middle of the night if necessary. And we've seen great success. So with our Rapid DNA instrument, we get searchable results. So a DNA profile that I can search against a database in over 75% of our cases. And of those cases that we conduct a search, we get a hit 40% of the time. So, and when this happens, when we get a rapid DNA hit, our prosecutors and law enforcement agencies know, because it's a rapid DNA hit, to work quickly to get additional evidence and to file the case. So if the evidence is probative, the rapid DNA hit allows for probable cause to obtain the search warrant or the arrest warrant. And in these cases, we see that the law enforcement agencies, so it's open countywide to over 30 agencies, they're able to collect this additional evidence, such as stolen property that can help build the case, or fresh witness or victim statements, such as a 6-pack ID lineup, or even fresh suspect statements where they're so shocked that they have been arrested so quickly that they even provide a full confession. So we see that our prosecutors are able to file these cases over 80% of the time. And we have a 99% conviction rate for these cases. And the reason it's 99% and not 100% is because one case, unfortunately, the defendant passed away before the case was adjudicated. So we've seen great success with this. And comparing it to our CODIS hits, our lab also, or our office also files all of our reviews and files any CODIS hits that are made at the lab. We see 40% of those cases being filed right away. And then a lot of them are stuck in the pending state where the law enforcement agencies have to go out, get more information, get more evidence, because when they get these hits from the lab months, 6 months, 10 months, even a year later, you have a lot less evidence there, and the DNA is not as impactful as it is when you get the DNA results in 2 hours like we do with rapid DNA.
Okay, thank you, Anna. The last of the pre-chosen areas would be prioritization of cases and samples for DNA analysis. Obviously, we are victims of our own success in the DNA business, so to speak. The demand is greater than the supply, so to speak. So the question is, what are the biggest bottlenecks in getting casework completed? Whether you're police, whether you're prosecutor, lab person. So, Anne-Marie, do you have any comments about what you find are the biggest bottlenecks in getting the casework completed that you need for your work?
Well, I hate to say this, but I'm sure it's true for everybody, is it's all about resources and how much money we're able to put into the laboratory work. I mean, the prioritization, it's pretty simple and pretty reasonable, is we're going to obviously identify the violent crimes first. We're going to work, our lab is going to work those cases just like every other lab is going to do. But what we also know from statistics, and Fred's really kind of mentioned this, is we know that drug crimes and property crimes lead to violent crimes. And we've seen from California DOJ's own studies that if we can identify those people early on, that we will, in fact, prevent crime, because we know that people that have committed violent crimes oftentimes have a history of drug and theft crimes. So the more we can do, the more funding we can get. But ultimately, the bottleneck really just comes down to resources and having the ability to do all those crimes, whether it's through grant funding from the feds or the state governments, or whether it's just your local governments dedicating those resources. But I don't ever want to underestimate the power of the tool, as Fred mentioned, to exonerate people. So we can never forget that this, people may not know that before we actually arrest somebody on a rape murder, 20 people were already eliminated because law enforcement collected samples. So it is the greatest tool ever to identify both the guilty and exonerate the innocent. So, but resources are the ultimate need. Yeah.
Does anyone else like to take that question? What's the big one more person? What is the biggest bottlenecks in getting casework completed? Anna, you're a lab person.
So for our lab, the biggest backlog is with property crime cases. Our county does always collect on property crime. It was an initiative that was started years ago. But, with these property crimes, it's high volume with lots of samples that can be tested. In addition to the crime scene evidence, you always have elimination swabs to test as well. So what our office implemented years ago is a process that we call triage, and that's guidelines to prioritize certain property crime cases and the evidence that will be tested. So with this process, they limit the number of crime scene samples to 3 crime scene samples that will be approved for testing at the initial stages. Of course, you can always go back and test more. So you always collect, and then just, the 3 most probative, most samples with the most forensic value and will be probative for the prosecutors are chosen to be processed at first, so that they can get through the cases quicker. Because we have a rapid DNA instrument, but not everything can be done through rapid. A lot of these property crimes, there's touch DNA, vehicle burglaries, you can swab the steering wheel, you can swab the gear shift. So our lab still plays a huge part in our solving property crimes. But, as Anne-Marie said, there's just not enough resources. There are not enough forensic scientists. There's not enough, just instrumentation at the lab to be able to do this. And without further resources, there's always going to be that backlog, no matter how much you limit the testing.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Same old, so to speak, with regard to resources, right? Anyway, let's take some audience questions now. To all the panelists, how might you couch forensic DNA tools in the recent grassroots call for police reform? So, with all, basically, how does forensic DNA tools, how do we couch these tools with regard to the recent calls for police reform? Anyone want to take that one up first?
I think a stab at that, Dr. Ballantyne. So I think it's important. I mean, yes, there's been calls for police reform, but people need to understand, and I've said it many times and I'll say it again, DNA is the greatest tool to find the truth, no matter what that truth is, whether it's somebody's guilty of a crime or whether somebody's exonerated of a crime. And there's no better example, at least from my perspective, than in California with our recent exoneration of an individual that was in prison for 15 years in another county named Ricky Davis, because it was through DNA that he was ultimately exonerated, and it was ultimately through genetic genealogy that the actual killer, who's now charged with this particular crime. So when we talk about police reforms, to me, I look at it more as a justice system question, is how are we assuring the public that we are not only arresting but prosecuting the right people? And truly, there's no better way to do that than the use of forensic DNA.
And Jack, Emery is exactly right, and I'm sure Anna can weigh in as well as far as the laboratory side. People are just scared of it. If we called DNA something else, ABC, maybe people wouldn't be afraid of it. But they're so afraid of DNA. They think that law enforcement is getting your darkest secrets of your family. And, are you blue-eyed or green-eyed or right-handed, or are you this or you that? It doesn't tell us anything but male or female. And it points a person to a crime scene. It's unbelievably accurate. People are so scared of it. If anything, the DNA, people should embrace it more, but it's going to ensure that the guilty people go to jail and the innocent people are not incarcerated. DNA helps do that. And I think people are just afraid of it because of television, because of TV shows that are misrepresenting it, because people don't understand it, because people think of shows like Jerry Springer. We're not looking for who, you are the father. That's not what we're doing out here. We're trying to put somebody to a crime scene. And if you're not attached to that crime scene, if you're not the person that did that, then you're not going to come up and you're not going to hit. And it's unbelievable technology. And I think people just don't understand it. I didn't understand it till 2010. We got involved in it. If you told me I'd be talking about DNA now 10 years ago, I would have told you were crazy, that I had no interest in it. But it is the latest and greatest, and rapid just ups the game. It's just unbelievable, the amount of work that it can do and the amount of crime it can solve and prevent. And I think we can't forget that prevention, like Anna said earlier. It truly prevents crime, and it's a number that's not measurable.
Thanks, Jayann. Would you like to contribute to this question?
Yes, I would. I think the thing that we need to remember is that DNA is science, and in the CODIS DNA, there's markers for ethnicity. So if we using DNA to its fullest potential is the greatest hope that we have to eliminate racial bias in our criminal justice system, because either those numbers match or they don't. As Anne-Marie said, it's the truth. And that's what we need. We need the truth to find the true perpetrators of crime and to exonerate the innocent and to absolutely eliminate racial bias in our criminal justice system.
Thank you. Anna, are you okay, or would you like to contribute to that question?
I think the other presenters have spoken.
Yeah, okay. A question for Anna and maybe Fred. What type of training does the police agencies have prior to using rapid DNA? So for Anna, and then potentially Fred.
In Orange County, we go to all of our agencies and train them on how to collect the evidence for rapid DNA testing. So we continually go out. We have a training presentation that we do. And since there's always high turnover, new people being brought onto different teams, new detectives, we're continuously training. And our officers at the outside agencies that are not part of the DA's office do not actually test the evidence on the instrument. We have investigators that are employed by the DA's office, investigators and investigative assistants that are trained here in the office to run the instrument. And they go through a more rigorous training process, which is analogous to crime lab training. So they observe it using the instrument. They do supervised training of the instrument. There's a mock samples competency test. There's a written competency test. There's required readings. So they go through a very rigorous training program before they're allowed to use the instrument and process these DNA samples.
Okay, thank you. This is for Anne-Marie and or Jayann. In some countries, the law prohibits collecting samples for DNA databases from convicted offenders because a person should not be forced to produce evidence against him or herself. What's your view of that? This is Jayann. Do you have Anne-Marie or Jayanna?
Well, in the United States, you don't have any kind of constitutional right not to provide physical evidence if physical evidence is not considered to be a violation of the Constitution. So we have and when Jayann talks about the movement across this country to collect samples, not just from convicted offenders, but from felony arrestees, there's a whole body of law that supports that collection of evidence. And quite frankly, as far as I'm concerned, is when we have those types of individuals, whether it's arrestees or convicted offenders, we should be collecting because it, again, obviously identifies individuals and eliminates others.
Jayann, do you have any comment on that?
I totally agree with Anne-Marie. I believe that it's just identification. That's all it is, and that's what the Supreme Court of the United States has ruled. So I believe that it should be used in this manner.
Okay. Well, I think we're running out of time now. We haven't got into all of the questions from the audience. So I think typically what would happen is that these questions will be collated and answers provided after the meeting to the person asking the question. So we need to close the session now. I'd like to thank but before doing so, of course, what we've heard is that rapid DNA is being used right now in the criminal justice system within the US, and with some success. And that is tied into the use of voluntary databases as opposed to the standard CODIS type databases. And the use of this is expected to increase not only by law enforcement, but within the crime lab itself. But in terms of DNA databases, we still need to expand the use of these databases, expand the number of offenders, the types of offences. We haven't gone as far. We haven't even discussed the potential for a universal database. We didn't get to that. But DNA plays a major role. It's objective. It doesn't only help to convict the true perpetrator, but also to exonerate the innocent. So we always have to be aware of that. And education is a very important part of trying to persuade the body politic through education, basically, to provide the necessary resources. Because, of course, as we've talked about already, resources are a big issue still. So typically you want faster, better, and cheaper. We've always gone with better. We've now gone to faster. Faster is rapid, etc. But we also, we need to talk about the cheaper aspect as well, because with it becomes cheaper, it's easier to sell to the body politic. So with that, then, I'd like to thank the panelists for their time and expertise, the organisers and support staff at Thermo and LabRoots for putting on this meeting, both virtually and across 3 different worldwide time zones, and of course to all of the audience participants, without whose presence we would literally be speaking to an empty room. I hope it has been of some value to all. Thank you, everyone.